Let me ask you about the big proposal that you guys had earlier this year about trying to improve and expand government service, to make the vetting process more efficient, to streamline the confirmation process, to both figure out how to do on compensation and certain things that where people don't pay as big a financial penalty to go into government. And then the last thing is to sort of codify lessons learned in a better manner. Talk to us a little bit about what you guys have been doing to try to get these ideas into the system, because there are a lot of people who recognize that while the vigilance for conflict of interest is very, very important, it is actually serving as some of these rules are so onerous that it's dissuading very good guys from getting into government.
Vago, we came at this with a simple notion that there are some deterrents to public service. And the bench of qualified, accomplished Americans to serve is not deep enough. When we started this, for example, toward the latter part of 2013, 70% of the senior civilian positions in the Department of Homeland Security were vacant. In the Department of Defense, it was about 40%. So the reality is that it was a question of not only filling vacancies, but building the bench so that you had candidates to do so. There are three major areas of concern. Clearly, the vetting process can be onerous and expensive. And so one of the things we suggested is that both the Senate committees of jurisdiction and the White House and the other agencies of the executive branch make the questionnaires as similar or identical as they possibly can. Second thing is on divestiture. Two of the national security committees permit blind trusts. One does not. We need at least uniformity across the three jurisdictions of national security to allow people of means to consider service in a way that does not require them to impoverish themselves. And then the last thing is, you're absolutely right. Confirmation is a political process. Recognize that. But there are ways to accelerate that process. Perhaps at the assistant secretary level, there is a 30-day limitation on holds. With more senior people, perhaps it's a different situation. But the bottom line is to calibrate how the Senate deals with nominees in a way that, again, accelerates the process so that vacancies are fewer amongst those key agencies: FBI, Treasury, Defense, certainly DHS, and the intelligence community.
When you're talking about the impoverishment oath, I mean, there are some jobs, Pentagon jobs, that would require you to divest yourself of virtually any holding in any company that does business with the Pentagon. What are, and aside from the jurisdictional issue, what are some best practices that you think could be adopted that would allow folks the ability to at least maintain some of the wealth that they've created for themselves if they take one of these government jobs?
I think, let me give you an example. When the current CEO of Yahoo came from her former company, clearly there were intellectual property concerns and there were conflict of interest issues between the two corporations. And the two boards worked it out satisfactorily. And so what we're saying is that this is a fairly routine occurrence in the private sector. And the reality is that for business people of means, the idea would be to deal with conflict of interest in an intelligent way. I would argue personally that blind trust is one of those mechanisms. There are clearly others, but the idea here that an individual would have to sell all of his individual holdings to put them into generic mutuals, I think deters many people, qualified people, from serving. And so we need to balance the legitimate considerations for conflict of interest with ways to sort of insulate people from making decisions in their own self-interest.
Would higher penalties for punishment be something that, for example, if somebody does transgress, they would get hit harder, for example, and be made a public example of, for want of a better word, thereby allowing more people to serve?
I think the bottom line is there are already criminal penalties associated with violating conflict of interest, and they should be pursued. in cases where people cross the line. But my own view is that there are many patriots here who would like to serve, and we need to find a way to give them a bit of trust, to believe in their best nature, if you will. Now, some might suggest that that's naive. I don't think so. People I've worked with over the years, are good people.
Well, how many people would you say that you work with that fall into that category? Because there are those who say that the entire structure seems to be built around some exceptions rather than the norm, which is actually a remarkable number of honest people who are trying to do the job right.
Clearly, I know of only a handful of cases of debarment, for example, in my 40 years. And so it doesn't happen that frequently. And so, I know the committees of jurisdiction are concerned about the fact, in the case of defense, that it has a $600 billion budget, and that the potential for abuse is far greater there than in other agencies. I accept that. But I also think the mission of the department makes it more difficult for folks at senior levels to take their own self-interest as more important than the nation's interest. At least that has been my experience over the years.
What do you think are the best ways to, both on the military and the civilian side, when you were talking about civilian incentives, what are some of the best ways to do that in a force of the future context, where you want to incentivize perhaps efficiency, you want to incentivize innovation, as opposed to what happens sometimes now is you may have some very, very innovative ideas that, despite all the data, clashes with either a service's perception of, wait a minute, that's great, but now that undermines my story that I've been telling for a long time, for example, or it undermines a particular program that I've got a lot of time and skin invested in. How do you work that for years now?
I think, look, you don't want to create a mercenary force. So, the logic of having a compensation system that is 100% performance-based, it maybe has some risk. But I do believe that having a system that has performance characteristics, components, is vitally important, and typically that's not the case today. We get paid based on longevity, and not on the difficulty of the job or your output. And this is something that business is very good at doing. And I think the initiatives which have been suggested have great promise. We need to think about them in terms of recruiting and retention, something that's a bit arcane but is essential. But the bottom line is there's a place for incentivizing people financially for performance while they serve in the armed forces, in my view. As every organization in Washington has ups and downs, Ben's has been one of those organizations that has gone up and down in terms of its influence and its profile and visibility. You came here, I think, to help change that. How are you sort of re-engineering the focus of the organization, and what are some of the things that folks should be expecting over the coming years coming from Ben's? I think we're all about product, Vago, and this is ideally it is government partners that come to us and ask for help. On occasion, maybe we have an idea, but we never move forward without a government partner, because it's essential to have one on takeoff with a project rather than trying to recruit one on landing. But the bottom line is one of the projects you mentioned, public service, is a good example of trying to do things that clearly have relevance. And that is manning the ship, the airplanes, with the appropriate mix of military and civilian officials in the Department of Defense is a vitally important thing in getting people that are qualified. And not just gray hairs like you and me, but rather the mid-career folks who can't afford perhaps to take as much risk for a career change. They might under the right circumstances. And that way you get youth, you get new ideas, and you get energy that is so vital.
One of the issues is a growing civilian military gap. 1% of the nation serves, 99% doesn't. And what is the education role that you see, as there are fewer and fewer people who've served, have military service? There are some in industry who are, do have military experience in their past, but an enormous number don't. And that's a trend that's expected to go forward. I guess it's a two-pronged question. First, from an education standpoint, what's the challenge, and what do you find when you meet with some folks? What are the sort of fundamental misunderstandings perhaps they have in military service that you have to help educate them on?
I think that's one of the roles we play in Business Executives for National Security. Frequently, we're hosted at military installations, and our members attend these opportunities at their own expense and learn about what is happening at the SEAL Schoolhouse, or in the Air Force remotely piloted aircraft pipeline, or visiting the Minot, North Dakota in February to sort of review the nuclear mission. They knew we wanted to be there, by the way. The bottom line is that those opportunities allow our members to become better informed about the armed forces and what they do. Importantly, it allows the kids that are hosting us to see people in open collar or in coat and tie, and discover that there are people in the 99% who care, who really do care. And that's one of our roles, is to close that gap between the 1 and the 99.
What do you see as, as one of the things that Secretary Carson is trying to do is figure out ways to expand service? Are the limits at, early 40s a mistake, and should we be able to open certain jobs up, older, logistical jobs, do not deploy jobs, for example? Because historically the focus has always been, it's sort of a one-size-fits-all model. If you go into the reserve, for example, you become a deployable asset from word go. What are some, and you and I have talked about this over the years, but both on camera in interviews, but also privately, what do you think are some ways to potentially expand service to harness some of that talent that exists out there, in terms of, different categories of service that the department ought to be considering to take advantage of this talent?
I think this is one of the larger areas of Secretary Carson's work, and I know the Navy is looking at this as well. The bottom line is, and this is on the recruiting side, to be able to compete for talent, particularly in very important fields that are highly competitive, you need to make some adjustments. And so it might be that high-tech qualified people who are not deployable, typically, might not have to meet the same criteria that deployable personnel do for fitness and readiness and so on and so forth. And a good way to do that, and by the way, we're visiting Seattle in a couple weeks, a Ben's visit, and we will be meeting with the National Guard unit in Seattle that is an Air Force, Air National Guard, that does cyber work. There is a mechanism for having folks that are current, qualified in the private sector also serve and serve their country and make contributions technically, through their service in the Air National Guard. So there are a number of ways to, but a key thing is not everybody will wear a suit. Not everybody will have a set of ACUs in the closet. Not everybody will maintain firearms qualification. The idea is we need to be smart about what the skill requirement is, where they work, how they do their jobs, and make choices accordingly.